members of the table who have already sent in some feedback and questions around the particular submission. To point out, community member B. Larissy and Angela Bell will talk through the changes that have been made and how that's been reflected in our draft that's now hopefully with all of you in printed form. So just sing out if you don't have this on your tepu, on your table, but we'll pass over to Angela.
Kia ora, thank you again. This is the consideration of another draft submission for the morning on the sale and supply of alcohol. This one is a little bit more narrow than some of the submissions we've been dealing with this morning. It's not kind of big system reform. It's looking at some specific changes that are going to be made or that are proposed to be made to this legislation that have some quite specific changes that they're seeking. So they're looking to remove appeals processes for local alcohol policies. They're looking to remove the questioning of parties by others as part of and cross-examination from part of licensing hearings. They are looking to allow anyone to object to an alcohol licence, whereas the present system is really constrained as to who can actually object and participate in that process. And they're looking to introduce a new requirement for district licensing committees to develop procedures for hearings and allow the use of remote access technology for the conduct of meetings. So that one's nice and kind of administrative, but the other ones are reasonably targeted to how our DLCs can consider local alcohol policies and the considerations of our community when they're making those decisions. So we did have a draft that went out with the agenda, but we've also got a new one tabled this morning, which is covering off two comments from some conversations I had with Community Board member B. Larissy and with Sophie as well. And so those two concerns were around whether or not we wanted to create any limitation on the scope of who could object to an alcohol licence. So there was some concern that we were going from it being too constrained from basically no one being able to participate unless you lived within a kilometre of the licence, to it being too open and anyone from anywhere, whether it's in New Zealand or outside, to be able to submit and have their say. So we've made some changes to the submission to try and create a little bit more clarity about what we'd like to see the scope to be, and broadly left that sort of put some principles in there that we think need to be considered, and then left it there. The second comment was around the shift to a different type of hearings process and the skills that are required for that. And we've just removed a reference that is on page 8, sorry to get technical, of your of the revised one, which had an exemption for if people had formal legal training, they weren't going to have to go and do any further training. And we've just kind of accepted that actually we think it would be good for everyone to do that, because it's quite a different type of a hearing process that isn't necessarily doesn't necessarily come natural to lawyers who are used to the kind of traditional processes that we might have. So I guess we need to seek to formally table that version that has those changes, and then we can talk a little bit more about what's in there if we need to.
So any questions on the report in front of us or the revised draft submission that we have? Councillor Halliday.
I have three things I want to discuss or bring up. First one's very simple. Number one is asking the council to talk or not talk to the submission. Which one are we going to do?
That's up to the table and the person who chooses to move that recommendation, but I would suggest that we might want to speak, and maybe it's that we make the decision to speak and then offline we decide who ends up doing that, but I'd presume it would be the mayor and maybe a staff member, but we can, depending on who moves the recommendations and which one they want to move, that's up to them.
Okay, yep.
But it's over the page,
Yep, I've got that. Sorry.
Recommendation B.
Okay, my next point is referring to page 57 on the agenda. The commentary around declining renewals. The second which is commentary, first, second, third paragraph. Council supports reform provision allowing the DRC or ARLA to decline renewing a licence if it considers renewing the licence will be inconsistent with the location or licence density elements. I just want to bring up a concern I had with that, and I had actually had a fine discussion with Community Board Chair Larissy over here, and he brought a different perspective to what my thinking was. But I'm a little bit concerned that what we're supporting here is the ability for the DLA to refuse a renewal of a licence if it doesn't adhere to the LAP. And I think that's a bit unfair to established businesses as such, because this is going to go through a transitional process, if you like, and there'll be a lot of established businesses or businesses that are looking to sell, where if there is direction to enforce the LAP with regards to basically non-renewal of a licence, shouldn't it just be taken into consideration as part of the process? It would be just, I suppose, point in case, if the LAP says there's going to be five businesses in a district, in a certain geographical area, and then when we implement that, the person comes up for renewal and the other six, well, there is actually six in that area, say for argument's sake, how do we transition through that? Now, is that something that just gets sorted out through the through the process of the renewals as such? But if I had a business and I wanted to sell it, it would be quite hard to do if I didn't know that okay, yes, there might be some hour changes, there might be some other changes, but if my license could not be renewed potentially just because I don't meet what the current new LAP says, that could prove difficult.
Thanks, Councillor Halliday. I'll pass over to James Jefferson for a response to that.
And Ange and Catherine McClellan from our Environmental Services might be able to help as well. But I think the point I wanted to make in response through you, Madam Chair, to Councillor Halliday's question, if the business is being sold, it will require a new licence anyway, which will require to comply with the LAP once we've adopted one. Yep. Renewal is a challenge, and it's the same challenge you have often with the Class 4 venues. So this is a fairly imperfect beast. But Ange or Catherine, I suspect that the renewal process, depending on where this amendment ends up, might present us with that conundrum here locally. But that's it.
Thanks, James. Just to add to that, I guess they're really good points to note, and we can put some clarity around that particular concern in there. Just with regards to what that provision is looking to do, it's not requiring that to happen, it's just allowing it to happen. So I think we can put some stronger wording in there if you would like around that needing to be a balanced consideration, but at the moment they're unable to do that, and this would just allow them to consider whether it's appropriate to renew that licence in light of a
I appreciate that it says in the current law, yeah, it must not take into account. It needs to be taken into consideration, but yeah, I'm just a little bit concerned that there might be aspects that are very unchangeable for a business that has no control over through a transitional period. And even from a licence renew perspective, they've still maybe got a 20-year history in the area as such. I think these rules are geared towards moving forward, not necessarily penalising retrospectively, if that makes sense. So it's just more, I fully appreciate that it needs to be taken into consideration, the LAP, of course it does. But I'm just a little bit concerned that that's maybe swinging the pendulum a little bit too hard that way as well. On page 58, sorry, bear with me. Sorry, on page 61. My apologies. I just want to ensure that this is not meant in any form of disrespectful manner. The wording in regards to the highlighted box there talks to the Act include Te Tiriti o Waitangi as a fundamental consideration for decision makers and the connection of Māori, iwi and hapu to their rohi, and places have become a fundamental consideration to decision making. I'm a little bit concerned about this being a fundamental consideration in both these areas, because the ability, I understand why this has been put in place, because if we take a point in case, what happened in Otaki is our Māori community were sidelined. But back at the, back in, well, it's just been amended actually, that pretty much gives everybody in the area the ability to be taken into consideration. I do wonder whether the wording, the connection of Māori, iwi and hapu to the rohi is recognised as a consideration to decision making, rather than it being a fundamental part of that decision making process, as in the licensing aspect of things takes in a lot of consideration with regards to well-beings, impact on community and all that sort of scenario there as well. And I'm a little bit concerned when we start using the words fundamental, it changes what's being done in that space with regards to law as such. Consideration, definitely, and that goes without saying. But that's already been covered, and I'm wondering if we're just going potentially, now I hate to use the word, a little bit too PC in this place.
We can definitely make an amendment on that basis if that's the view of the...
Look, I don't think the amendment should be made just on my word in relation to that. I'd like there to potentially be a little bit of discussion around it, perhaps offline, and maybe having talk to our the EV representatives at the table at the moment as well. I don't see that taking away any ability for Māori in all aspects to put forward a very strong representation in that space. That's now been allowed for as such. Yeah. I'll be interested in any other comment with regards to that. That's it for me.
Cool, thank you, Councillor Halliday. I think maybe to avoid getting into a discussion about one particular word, if we do take that offline and have a conversation maybe directly with our iwi partners about the feeling around that before the submission is finalised. Are you happy with that, Councillor Halliday? Yep. Okay, cool. Councillor Spies.
Thank you. Now, I'm not sure if you wish to answer this or want to answer this, but I need to verbalise it. But I'm just wondering, does Council actually really believe that these changes will actually make a difference to alcohol consumption?
That Catherine might have something to say on this as well, but I will make a start if you like. So I guess our role in the regulation of alcohol and how it affects our community is quite narrow. We're part of a much bigger system where there are a lot of other things at play. The thing that we do have available to us is the choice of whether or not we formulate a local alcohol policy, and that's something that we're going to be bringing to you guys to think about later in the training. What will change for the better in this instance is the ability for our District Licensing Committee to more widely consider the issues that are at hand, and potentially that will help them make different decisions on licensing applications than we've seen in the past. It's been a real challenge for our communities to be able to be heard. I mentioned before, if you wanted to be to submit, you basically have to live within a kilometre of where the licence will be. That is incredibly narrow when we have when the impacts of these premises can have impacts that are much more widely felt in our community as a whole. So just the ability for our District Licensing Committee to be able to consider those broader impacts will help us have some more influence in the system. But that's not to say, I mean, the outcomes of that system are always going to be indirect from the perspective of what policies Council puts in place around this only has a narrow scope of influence. But my view is that it will be better. Do you have anything to add, Catherine? Sure.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. I'm one of the licensing inspectors at Council, for those of you who I haven't met. I think we just need to remember that the intent of the Sale and Supply of Alcohol Act was to let the community be more involved in the process, and that doesn't seem to really have happened over the last 10 years. So I think this amendment is just trying to do what should have happened 10 years ago, to enable the community to be more involved in the process. So it's one step forward, yeah. But there's a lot of other things they should also be looking at in the bill, yeah.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks, Ange. Councillor Wilson.
Yeah. So that potential, that possible conflict is because I'm the chair of DLC, obviously. So, but a couple of things is, for those who aren't aware of this, we don't have a local alcohol policy. It's debatable whether or not we should. We've had some conversations around that. When we go down that path, I would recommend that Steve McDowell, that we bring him on board and have a chat about that. He addressed us earlier. I would, and I don't want to do wordsmithing here as an editor, but the word fundamental consideration, I think, is in there. It is, I believe, something of a direction to decision makers. If you ascribe something as being a fundamental consideration, then it's something that you don't have a choice about whether or not you should. It's fundamental, right? And there's a whole bunch of statistics that suggest that it should be a fundamental consideration. Anyway, that's just that aside. And this is all about, the responsible sale and supply of alcohol in the community. And I agree entirely that what this does is that it gives the community the opportunity to be involved much more and more freely. And there are some issues about whether or not the objection process is going to be too wide. Some people may remember back in the day of Resource Management Act, where if you objected to somebody building a fence in Otaki but you happened to live in Invercargill, you could make that objection, and it just drove people nuts, and so they changed it. And so there's a potential here if you are just a staunch anti-alcohol person, and if you're tuned into the system anywhere around the country where anybody makes an application to do anything, you could object to it, and if it's objected to, you're going to throw it into a hearing process. That in itself can be quite expensive and time-consuming, etc. So there's a bunch of things, but I'll let it go at that.
Thanks, Councillor Wilson. Mia Holborough.
Yes, I'm looking at the box on page 60, where the submission is proposing that the council does not support the amendments that would no longer permit those who appear at hearings to question any party or witness in cross-examination. Could I just, I'm not very familiar with DLC hearings. Are we proposing that people in the hearing, for instance, applicants and submitters, can cross-examine each other? The bill is proposing to remove that.
Yes, so currently there is cross-examination, and often that is done by legal counsel, particularly for corporations, and applicants will bring their lawyers and they will cross-examine members of the community if they've been able to submit.
So we're proposing that instead of that, members of the community can cross-examine each other.
Do you want to speak to that?
So at the moment, all parties can ask questions of each other in a set order, controlled by the chair. So yes, the bill is proposing to only allow the DLC committee members themselves to question all the other parties. And
do you know why the bill is proposing that?
I think it's going too far in terms of not wanting the objectors to be questioned. potentially. Whereas I think the questioning process is very useful for all parties to understand where each other are coming from. We had a hearing just last week with some public objectors, and there were no lawyers present, well, not as legal representation anyway of any of the parties. And I think it flowed very well. I don't think anybody felt intimidated. It was just a way of getting a better understanding of each other's positions.
So the recommendations in this box are a reflection of what, in the opinion of staff, would make for hearings that
Yes,
are
so we would like it
inclusive and
to
effective.
continue that everybody can question each other, but just have no lawyers representing any of the parties. Because the applicant hides behind their lawyer, we don't get to talk to them directly. As well as the members of the public feeling intimidated by being questioned by a lawyer.
So I'm interested in who you'd have instead of legal counsel. Say you were New World Supermarket, who within your organisation would then represent the organisation at the hearing?
The store owner, the owner of the supermarket, the applicant, whoever controls the company that's going to be holding the licence.
Great, thank you.
Just to add one small point to that this does represent a shift from an adversarial to an inquisitorial process, so it kind of aligns with that general move.
That's really good clarification to have. Thanks for the question and the answers from staff. Councillor Cooper.
I was sort of, through you, the Chair, it was a little bit answered through Janet's questioning, but the reasoning why a lawyer shouldn't be at the hearing, this is reasonably complex legislation for the layperson. So for the little fella down the road who owns a super liquor or a corner dairy, I think it's probably a bit tough to turn up and try and understand and advocate for his small business. I understand there's reasoning for your big supermarket giants and the big corporates, but I would suggest that most liquor licenses are held by one-man bands or families who don't have a good grasp of legislation. So if they can't bring someone in who can advocate for them, then I see that as being a big issue. And perhaps the chairs of the boards or the hearings are the appropriate people to monitor the interactions between the applicant and the objectors. Is it a step too far? Is my question, and I'd like to see some. I think there's some really good thought behind that before we blanket no representation, because effectively some people might be losing their businesses without a licence. Any comment on that?
Well, in my experience, it's only been the big corporates that do bring lawyers to hearings. A lot of the, as you call them, the one-man bands or the family licensees, they do represent themselves. I mean, some have sought legal advice to prepare for the hearing, but not many of them have brought lawyers. They can't afford them. But also it is the responsibility of a licensee to understand their obligations, to be able to hold a licence. I think Arla have said, a licence is a privilege, it's not a right. So in my opinion, they should be able to represent themselves. And if language is an issue, then of course, that could be allowed for, but it's just the big shot lawyers, I think, that they're trying to keep out of the process to make it as easy for the community to participate as possible. I've seen people really be grilled, it's not nice. And it's not just the public objectors, it's also the reporting agencies, myself, the police can stand up themselves a bit better, but some of the rest of us are not used to being grilled by lawyers.
So would it not be better targeting those big organisations instead of a blanket
Or I don't know if that's possible. I don't know.
Well,
how
in
you
our
would do
submission,
that.
it's possible, isn't it?
Yeah, surely. Yeah.
So that's possibly a consideration.
How do you differentiate? Yeah, I'm not sure how that would work in practice.
Well, that's for
Yeah.
that's for the central government to decide, but we could submit if we so chose to.
Through you, I think, Councillor Cooper, that in our submission we could suggest that more consideration could be given to how that might work in practice, because I think our response has focused on the recommendations on the table, and it might be that we think further work might need to be done if that's something that you as a whole would agree with. We could add that to our submission, so it might be that nuance.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, you can probably clarify that a little bit too. In terms of taking away the battalions of lawyers that some of the larger applicants may come up with, to just, Trevor and Mary who've got the liquor store down the road, they are able to provide evidence prior to the hearing. In fact, they're expected to, obviously. So very often the chair, the hearing committee will make decisions based on the papers anyway. A lot of it's based on the papers. So those applicants are able to have a lawyer, whatever assistance they require, to basically put their case. This is really, the hearing is to tease out more information, and of course the hearing chair and the panellists can ask whatever questions they like of anybody. And so the whole point, I think, is that, for the chair and the panellists is to ensure that that all of the parties are fairly heard, because ultimately you want a good decision and not have people be browbeaten, which they can be. It could be hugely intimidating. So, yeah, just going back to that, I don't think any applicant is not going to be fairly heard because they can be represented through the papers. They can have as much legal support as they like in that process. And again, I think it's up to the chair and the panellists to ensure that everybody gets a fair hearing. I think what the intent of this was, I don't want to second guess Kerry Allen, but I think the intent of this was to stop, as Catherine's already pointed out, the unfairness that goes on in that process, because it can be really unfair for some people.
Kia ora, Councillor Wilson, and just a reminder that we are still in question time, so if we can stick to questions on the submission and the report in front of us. But James Jefferson, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just to pick up on Councillor Wilson's point, and parties...
Oh, sorry, you're still green.
Just to pick up on Councillor Wilson's point, these are quasi-judicial settings, and if a party feels they've been unfairly treated through the process, they have the right of appeal to ALA. So, going that one next level up, and I think you're quite right. It's balancing the environment in there, and this actually was brought up many years ago when Sir Geoffrey Palmer did the review into the sale and supply of alcohol, and I think came up with something like 386 recommendations, of which the government of the day adopted about 30 and put them in here. So this has been an issue for many years, notwithstanding, as Councillor Cooper says, licensees might not be as familiar with representing themselves, but I think this is just balancing the books a little. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, that's useful. Community Board Member B. Larissy.
Oh, thank you. I do have a question. So the purpose there is to remove the lawyers from the process, so that presumably is representatives generally. Are we not adding them back in when the sentence says someone in Invercargill should be able to object on behalf of an elderly parent living in Kapiti? So that family member, for example, who's living in Invercargill, what is their right to be a representative? Where does that authority come from? And how is it limited to only family members and not lawyers? What if that family member is a lawyer? Are they then excluded? So I think you either have representatives or you don't. Trying to say you might in some circumstances becomes quite difficult.
Yes, there's definitely some complication in how those things balance together. I think the key point from the conversation around removal of lawyers is really about not removing any representation, but just removing that professional legal representation that can create that real imbalance of knowledge and of process and understanding of things. I guess the ability for someone to submit on behalf of, as the example is, an elderly parent, they're unlikely to kind of have that level of imbalance in the system that would create an unfair playing field for everyone. So that's dealing with two slightly different issues, I think, there with the specifics around legal representation and then the kind of wider question around how interested do you have to be as an interested party to be able to participate in the process.
It becomes difficult. I was just thinking of the employment legislation where I think Section 236 of the Employment Relations Act authorises any person to represent a person in an employment dispute, which was intended, of course, to allow unions and non-lawyers act, but it's become more legalistic because lawyers aren't excluded, which perpetuates the problem. So I imagine the same would happen in the liquor licence situation. I think it's a good idea. I think eliminating the lawyers from the process is healthy because they do totally skew the whole environment. My fear is that in opening it up to some representation, they'll get their foot in eventually. Right? But yeah.
Yeah, that's noted, thanks. And we can, the way we have tried to draft the new additional wording around who's in and out, we can try and sort of bring some of that nuance in there if that's the kind of feel of things. We've tried to keep it kind of at a principle space, so we can probably try and work some of that clarification in there.
Cool, thanks for accommodating that. Kim Tahiwi.
Kia ora. Yes, I agree taking the lawyers out of the picture is a good thing. My question was, and I think it's been answered already, is can people who are going into this process get legal advice? And obviously they can. So then if we're talking about imbalance, if your big corporates can get legal advice and the people who are objecting can't, do we still have an imbalance given that paperwork has to be submitted and you're still getting submissions from in a legal context and people who may not know the ins and outs of it in a non-legal context, so that is still unbalanced? Are we considering that?
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. Community law is very willing and ready and able to help anybody in the community to object. They have specialised staff for this very purpose. We've tried to put some members of the community in touch with Rob from Community Law, but yeah, definitely there is legal advice available for the community. Oh.
So in your experience, how many people actually take that up? Is that well used or?
In my experience, no, and I'm not sure why, because we've tried to make those connections. Some members of the community have come to council seeking us to help represent them, which is not appropriate. So we put them in touch with the organisations out there that are there to do that. So I'm not sure why there hasn't been. That's just in Kapiti. I'm not sure throughout the rest of the country.
Yeah, so in terms of the balance, even though the option's there, it's still not being taken, so there's still an imbalance. I just wonder how we can address that. Maybe we also address the fact that there's better emphasis on that legal option and that legal support if we're also going to take away the legal. I mean, I'm all for the lawyers leaving the room, don't get me wrong, but there seems to still be an imbalance to the mum and dad down the street in terms of getting through the legislation.
Yeah, it's a really well made point, and I think that's been noted by the team. So thanks, Kim. Mayor Holborough.
Oh, sorry, I thought there were no more questions, but a light's just gone on. I was just going to move the recommendation.
Oh, I think we've got 2 more, 3 more. Oh, sorry. Was yours in relation to the conversation that's just being had? There we go. You're on now.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Just quickly, it's quite surprising that we're in this level of legal conversation without our legal representatives in the room. And I'm just checking to see that there are provisions in the recommendations for the paper to be looked over and the final wording in the submission looked over by our lawyer. Just given that the discussion we're going into about removing lawyers from rooms appears in substance to contravene the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 11, where everyone has the right to defend themselves. So, yeah, I just wanted to sort of bring that point up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Also, the point is we might be actually moving into the area of telling businesses how to run their business. What happens if the business owner is a lawyer? What happens if the business owner is in Auckland and they want a representative, an agency? How do we deal with those situations? I think what we need to do is actually address the situation where there seems to be an imbalance of power here. So it's the cross-examination of some professional against someone who's not. What are we doing to actually help tilt the scales for the average person to actually get better representation is probably what I think we should be considering. Why aren't we advertising the fact that we actually have free legal services around that, and you should actually consult them before you come here if you can't afford your own legal advice? So is it an information issue that we're missing here? So I think that we need to tilt the scales to our advantage rather than try to put legislation in which probably won't pass ultimately.
Yeah, another point well made. And I think that, as Chris mentioned there, luckily it's not our job to be drafting this legislation, but we can make the suggestion that consideration be given to that sort of that balance or imbalance, and how that could be reflected through the final legislation. I think that was what summed up. Councillor Pravanov.
Thank you, through the chair. So it's interesting conversation, and I agree that that often in these hearings there's probably quite an imbalance between the various parties, and a way needs to be found to reduce that balance. And I think one of the ways potentially is by not having lawyers there, because it just makes the difference greater, and a situation of Samson and Goliath can be extended. But I have a question, a specific question in relation to the submission on page 7. Second paragraph, it says here, halfway through it, it says, including the applicant to be allowed to be represented at the hearing by legal counsel. And then below it, it says removing by counsel. But to me, that's still leaving the word legal there. So is that the intent of, is that actually the right wording in there?
We can double check that against the bill to make sure that we've included exactly the right words that we need to have the intent that we're looking for there.
Okay, because I'm not sure whether by removing the words by council refers to what's in the bill, or whether it actually refers into what we're submitting on.
Those words by council that we've got italicised there appear to be referring to the section of the bill, so we can make sure that we've got the right reference there.
Okay, thank you.
And Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, just I'll phrase it as a question at the end, but just for just for some clarification here, it's not like you're getting the parties and you're just chucking them in a room and say sort it out, right? And the big guy always wins. That's what you have the DLC for. So the DLC's role is to ensure that there's balance, that all of the parties are fairly heard. If they're not fairly heard, then there's a process for dealing with that. Also to ensure that there is a proper inquisitorial process as opposed to an adversarial process. One of the recommendations is that DLC members are appropriately qualified, as is the case with RMA commissioners. And I agree 100% with that. And I see I'm not quite sure what shape that might take, but that's one of the recommendations that we have here. And so I promised there would be a question, so I'll make one up. What were QCs and now KCs, as they can still have a role, obviously, in the papers. But one of the questions would be, and my understanding is that if you're a lawyer, you're not prohibited from being in the room by virtue of the fact that you're a lawyer. We had a hearing just recently where one of the parties was actually a lawyer, but wasn't there acting as a lawyer. Just happened to be that's what the party's job was. So I don't think you're a lawyer, so therefore you can't come into the room. You just can't come into the room and act as a lawyer, I think. But there is a point of clarification. If I'm a lawyer acting for a party under the changed legislation, can I still be in the room to be, I'm not in a role other than I can take advice about how things are going, and then I can advise my client, etc. So is that still going to be, acceptable under this, because it's not immediately clear?
Thanks. I think we can make sure that it's clear on how we've done it, but as it stands in that box we were talking through, our recommendations, we've said to exclude the attendance of legal counsel rather than lawyers. So I think that's probably the nuance there, but we can make sure that in the kind of description that's appropriately reflected.
Where are we? There we go.
I'm happy to move the recommendations.
Perfect. So would you want to move both A and B, and with B in terms of appointing 2 people to speak on the submission? Are you happy with the approach that we decide that we want to speak and then between ourselves decide who that's going to be, or would you, as the mover, want to put some names into those spots?
I'd like to make a suggestion.
Yeah.
That Nigel and Catherine probably have the most experience in this area and have, really well explained in practice how things operate and why we've made the calls that we have, and also being able to draw on those real life examples, I think is really powerful. I came in with some doubts today, but having heard the explanations and the examples today, sorry, I'm kind of debating before you have a second.
It's all right, I'll allow you to.
But it's just, just in terms of those two names. I think we could put or alternates.
Yeah.
Just so that if somebody's not available or. So I'm moving all the recommendations with Nigel Wilson and Catherine
McClellan? McClellan. Is that a question she can ask? Yeah, did you want to put your microphone on, Justin?
Thank you. I certainly acknowledge the knowledge that Councillor Wilson has in relation to the district licensing work. I'm just wondering whether it's appropriate that he actually, as a commissioner, whether he actually is, whether it's appropriate that he actually represents this council.
We are in debate, but just to get clarity on that one question, and then we'll move to, to properly debating the motion. Debate once it's on the table. Yeah. Councillor Warwick, seconded. So can we just insert that now into debate, Jocelyn, the points that you've just raised?
As I said, I acknowledge the training and the experience that Councillor Wilson has had in relation to the work that he's done in this area, but I'm just wondering whether it's appropriate that he is actually the councillor, given his, I'm not sure if it's a conflict, but his interest in this area, whether he's the appropriate, whether it's appropriate that he actually represents his council in terms of our submission.
Is there any kind of technical, anything technically wrong with that? So that's up to us as a table, and if that's the view that you hold, then that's fair enough.
I think that's a really good point. And as I said, we'll put in or alternate, and we can look into that and make sure that it's appropriate. I don't see that it would immediately that it would be an issue. I think it perfectly qualifies Councillor Wilson to do it, but it is a good point, and if we if we need an alternate, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Would be my suggestion. In terms of a right of introduction around the broader paper, so I'm moving the submission as it is, except with only one change, and that would be the consideration, but I'd like it to say serious consideration given to the role of legal counsel within these hearings, and to the possibility of excluding them. And I think that covers off any doubts we had around the legalities around that, because and that was Chris's suggestion, which I think was a good one. But I think serious consideration, because I don't think we want to understate what's been said to us today about how they impact on what these hearings should do. And I also think that it's necessary to make a strong point around that, because we're opposing the ability for this cross-examination. So if we're going to allow cross-examination, we really don't want it to be by lawyers, because I think what we're hearing is that leads to a less than ideal scenario for those in the room. So I'm not suggesting any changes around the word fundamental. I think that I think we should keep that. I do think it's fundamental.
Cool, thanks for that, and sorry for skipping over your right of introduction and going to that comment from Councillor Pravanov, just so it was addressed in the moment. Councillor Coe.
Just in relation to conflict of interest, I think we need to be really clear what conflict of interest actually means, and it's one of those terms that gets bandied around, and there would need to be some evidence of benefit or gain or undue influence. I think on the balance of things, the expertise that would be brought to the discussion would outweigh any of those negative effects. That's just my own view. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cooper.
Are we in debate?
We are in debate.
Yeah.
Yes.
I've just got some comments to make. Just in terms of LAP, as most of you know, I spent close to 17 years in the police. One of my roles was alcohol harm sergeant in Wellington, dealing with all the hotels and public order policing. And it would be fair to say that the LAPs have been an absolute epic fail over 10 years. And I think a lot of these recommendations in our submission will go a long way to fixing the hopelessness of what hasn't occurred. So I fully support most of what is in here. I also happen to be in hundreds of interviews over the years with legal counsel present, and most of the time they were there to observe the process and weren't able to speak. If they did speak, they were told they were not to speak. So I think there is some wriggle room here, possibly to submit that legal counsel may be present, but are for there to observe process only. I think that maybe gives a bit of balance, and it would give power to the chair. Just gives a bit more transparency of process, I think. So that would be my comment on that. In terms of Marty's point around the fundamental, I think that can be. I'm not happy with fundamental personally. I think we should have a look at that in consultation with our partners. That would be my view. So yes, on that I'll be happy to support the motion, with perhaps some thought around that legal side of things, not being so blunt on it. Oh, and lastly, sometimes it feels like in our discourse that the applicants are the bad guys, and they're actually not. They are trying to run legitimate businesses, a legal business. So I think we need to be careful sometimes that they're not actually the bad guys, the people out there trying to earn a crust. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Cooper. Councillor Halliday.
Through you, Madam Chair. Look, I just want to, I guess I've got a background in the hospitality industry as well, which comes to play when talking about this stuff. I'd like to endorse everything that Catherine said and Nigel said as well. It's quite relevant to a system that I think has been quite fraught for a while. We need to be very clear. There's two aspects here, in my opinion. Well, there's the local licensing aspect and there's the LAP aspect. Quite different, but with the same problems. If you like, more so on the LAP perspective, because it is council that's been getting in the way of those being progressed as such. And to me, it has just been a tactic rather than being constructive. So being able to get these policies through in a reasonable manner, I think, is highly overdue. So I'm very glad to see that we're how we've put our submission together. Another thing to consider with regards to representation is language barriers. We get a lot of people who have dairies and such like in our areas, and there are language issues as well, but it doesn't necessarily mean they need legal counsel for that. As I say, and I do believe that legal counsel brings an adversarial approach to these meets, and from what I've seen with council officers and also with DLC panels and chairs, they are quite capable of pulling out the information that's required to make a decision, especially if people have done their homework properly and put the information that's required in the papers that are required. And all the licence applications that I've done have been relatively straightforward. It's really only when you're trying to do things that are outside the parameters of the norm, if you like, or substantially outside the parameters of the norm. If you're putting a new business in place, a lot of those issues will be more than likely addressed through the RMA process with regards to consenting and all that sort of scenario there as well, where people can also object to areas, and I guess that's where the LAP can also come into effect potentially as well. So very happy to be supporting this motion as we go through, and think it's long overdue that we actually address this so that we can get our local alcohol policy in place and allows the rest of the country to do the same. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Councillor Halliday. Councillor Kirby.
Through you, Madam Chair. It's really great for us to have this opportunity to be able to submit on what I think is an incredibly important part of ensuring alcohol is distributed and sold well within our communities in appropriate ways, and for our communities to have a really strong voice around how that is and what they want and don't want. I think I just want to make a clear comment, and it's probably an answer to Kathy's question that she posed earlier. I don't think this ever addresses the issue of alcohol abuse or misuse, because that's a personal, a whānau, a community issue that can't be addressed through legislation necessarily. So I think I do want to acknowledge that we do have some problems in our community with alcohol abuse, and so I think that's a broader question on in our well-beings and probably in our social sustainability committees talking about that and what can be done to support work in that area beyond this work. I would tautoko the suggestion of the speakers to this. I'm of the opinion that their expertise adds weight to what they bring to the Justice Select Committee when they address that. I don't see a conflict of interest or any sort of conflict in that. I think it adds weight to our speaking and our submission for their experience and as the mover has suggested, the stories that they can tell of practical application and how that works for us as a district. I also want to just land on what Councillor Cooper mentioned about legal advice. I think that I would agree with the comment that legal advice does need to be in the room, but the weight really on what they can speak to and what they can't speak to needs to sit with the chair to ensure that the public that are there who are submitting are that the inequities that potentially exist around if you've got a high-powered lawyer sitting in the room, that those inequities are minimised through that process. So I would agree that I think it's only fair that people have legal representation and have advice in that room of how they're responding, but not necessarily have the lawyers speaking or questioning. So that would be something that I think maybe we could consider an amendment in that way with some wording there. I do agree with, again, the mover in around the wording of fundamental. I think Te Tiriti and Māori in our community need to have a really clear and strong voice because they statistically are most affected by alcohol within our communities. And I think because of that, they need to have a very clear sense and fundamental right to speak into these decisions that are made. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councillor Wilson. And Councillor Kirby, could you just press your microphone button? Awesome.
Yes, just a couple of reasonably brief points. That the role here is harm minimisation. You'll note that that's the name of the bill. The Sale and Supply of Alcohol Harm Minimisation Bill. Harm minimisation is the extra to what's there. And so all of this is about the responsible sale and supply of alcohol. Parties in a hearing include the police and public health, and they are parties who may or may not attend, but can. They bring that voice. They are parties who can be, under the current legislation, can be cross-examined by the other parties in the hearing. I agree with Councillor Cooper on a couple of points that he made. One is the applicants are not the baddies. It would be unfortunate if they were portrayed as such. Very often applicants are local clubs or local organisations applying for licences of all sorts of forms. And I also agree with Councillor Cooper about I don't mind the idea of legal counsel being present at all, as long as they're not an active party in the hearing. So I think an applicant or an objector should have the right to have a legal representative there who's hearing the same things that they're hearing. They're just not an active part of the hearing, and so then they are able to advise them. It may be subsequently later they go, well, here's all these grounds for appeal. I'm sure none of the hearings that I'm party to will have appeals, but that could be a consideration, and it's for any of the parties, including the police, for instance. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think we've fleshed out that point pretty well and kind of come to a good space in it. So that's good. Councillor Warwick.
Well, I was part of the Wānanga's, I was an objector to the Otaki off-licence a couple of years ago now. And I think it's really important that maybe as a council we do, even if we're advertising the licence application, that we put the information for submitters, because lawyers absolutely controlled that, and even the Wānanga submission, 2 of us objectors were wiped off the table because our submissions didn't stack up legally, and he just picked everything off with the legal, with the law, and even though it went to appeal, they lost it. And they went to appeal because lawyers did it pro bono, so it's a cost. But the objectors do need support, and lawyers absolutely don't need to be speaking because it is a total imbalance. Absolutely.
Thanks, Councillor Warwick. Kim Tahili.
Kia ora. Yeah, just to support, I support the speakers. With the experience, I think it's just only going to enhance the submission. I understand the registered conflict, but like Councillor Ko, I think we need to assess that because, you know, the risk may be low, so that needs to be assessed. In terms of the treaty fundamental consideration, yes, I'd like to take it off the table and go back and see where we sit with that. But just to say that, personally, I think all legislation should fundamentally consider Te Tiriti o Waitangi because it's there and that's what it's for. But the thing that I would question is how it's written. There's no guidance on, so as a practical example, if I'm the chair and you say consider the treaty, what does that mean? What does that mean for me? What part do I consider? Where am I looking? What am I doing in that space? So I think putting it in there is one thing, but then explaining how you actually play that out is a completely different thing, which we have missed for a very long time. We tend to put these words in there and think that's it. But then we give no guidance to people who maybe, you know, haven't been in that space before on how to actually carry that out. So that's my only comments on that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thanks for putting that into the corridor. Awesome. Community Board Member Beat.
Right, just very briefly, just in regards to not having lawyers represent, I just want to point out there is legal precedent in our legal system where they can't represent at the disputes tribunal. So, you know, we've got something to work with through that mechanism. Yeah.
Kia ora, Mayor Holbrow. Was this for a right of?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've got one more contribution. Community Board Member Simon Black.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, team. Look, I really support a lot of the comments being made here today about, you know, taking out the direct use of lawyers. I also am wanting to make just an observation in regards to the word fundamental. I think recently we've had issues in regard to entrenchment versus democracy, and I think it's very important to actually have the right wording because if we don't use the right wording, we could end up hurting the people we're trying to protect. So I really suggest that we look at what the fundamental is in regards to Councillor Kirby's response. We need to look at why abuse of alcohol occurs and understand how we can minimise that as opposed to trying to put things into legislation that really aren't going to address the problem itself. That's pretty what I have to say. Thank you.
This has been a really interesting conversation, probably longer than I might have expected it to go on for, but it's been quite fascinating, so I'm glad that it could run its course. I'll pass over to Mayor Holbrook for her right of reply, if there are no other contributions in debate. No?
Okay, I'm going to be really quick because I'm aware that we've got kind of half an hour to do our half-yearly report after this. But I'm just wondering, just in response to Kim's point about how to embed Te Tiriti into hearings. In the section District Licensing Committee Skills and Training, I think it's suggesting that the training should include Te Tiriti, but we've mainly pointed out the connection with inquisitorial approach. So I'm just wondering if that can be made a little bit more clear. I know that with the RMA Commissioner hearing, that's a huge part of the training that you do, and I wonder if we can make that comparison as well a bit clearer in the submission, and that might cover off that, because that would help with that consideration of how do you do that on the ground, making it fundamental. So I'm sticking with my original motion, and thank you for the contribution from members around the table.
Great, thank you. So we'll put that to a vote. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against? That's carried. And just one additional recommendation, which kind of came in slightly after we began the conversation around those first two. Recommendation C, just to table and I don't know the wording that we'd need around it, but just tabling attachment 2 as the kind of current amended submission. Yeah. So accept the tabling of the amended draft submission on the sale and supply of alcohol, community participation amendment bill. I'm happy to move that. Well, are there any questions first around? There's no report, so any questions on that recommendation and its wording? No, happy to move it. Can I have a seconder? Councillor Kirby. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Cool, thanks, STEM Services. Thanks, Ange. Thanks, Catherine. So I'll invite Mark de Haast up to the table now for item 8.5. We're running a little bit.
We have 2 minutes left, 5 minutes left.
But the next meeting doesn't start until 1:30.
So are we agreeing that we're going to short lunch or not? We'd have a half-hour break and then head into the climate and environment committee. Yeah, cool.
Just, sorry, Mark, before we pass over, just a bit of a heads up as to how the rest of the afternoon is likely to roll. So we'll run this through till 1 and then adjourn, have a half-hour lunch break, and then at 1:30 open the Climate and Environment Subcommittee, and then adjourn that, come back to this, finish it off hopefully nice and quickly, and then get back to Climate and Environment. Does that work? Oh wow, that's, yeah, we've got 2 options. It just depends on which way we all want to roll with it. But thanks, Mark. So yeah, let's stay focused. Stay focused. Keep your questions focused, relevant. We have already had a briefing as well, so remember that. Keep that in mind. But I'll pass it over to Mark to introduce the report.
Kia ora, everybody. Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. Look, I will take the report largely as read. There's 2 recommendations. Number 1 is to receive today's report. Number 2 is to note the Council's performance for the first half of the year. So generally speaking, it's actually a really tidy, really good performance. If we look at the metrics, 74% of our reportable performance measures have actually been achieved. And if you actually drill down to the sort of the 26% of performance measures that haven't been achieved, there's actually a common theme. Some of them have been narrowly missed, and the ones where there's quite a gap, it's, generally speaking, it's due to resources, staff shortages due to COVID or absenteeism, or just, difficulties actually recruiting staff. One of the performance measures we missed because of a satisfaction survey where residents responded, those that did respond are not happy with central government's plan for urban intensification. So from a performance measure perspective, that's a relatively strong result, 74%. 81% of our major projects with our capital works program are actually on track. From a financial perspective, Council is performing really well. We've got a very strong, very healthy balance sheet. The overall value of Council is just under $2 billion. Our assets are $1.8 billion. From a cash flow perspective, we're actually generating a positive cash flow for our operating activities. What that means is we aren't having to borrow money to pay for our operating expenses. Our sort of mainstream revenue, which is our rates and our fees and charges, is broadly speaking on budget. Due to timing differences, we're within our operating budgets, and we did finish the 6-month period with an $8.2 million surplus. And the report very, very clearly does set out that that's actually a temporary timing difference. It's largely due to receipt of capital grants and development contributions, which are used to fund our capital work program. So it's not a positive cash position. So we aren't overrating our residents. In terms of the resident opinion survey, so we've seen the results for the first 6 months of the year. There's 2. It's sample size is 200 residents per survey. We've seen overall satisfaction dip a little bit. The report has explained that the sort of level of dissatisfaction has remained constant, but we have seen a movement from satisfied customers into neutral. So neutral's gone up, satisfied's gone down. There's 253 respondents. Our total population of the Kapiti district is 56,500 people. So the resident opinion survey has definitely identified some trends. If we look at how we stack up against national trends, overall satisfaction, we're below sort of the national level. Our value for money, we're above. That's really good. That's a good, strong performance. And there's areas that we can work on and will work on, and we are looking at this over the next 6 months of the year. It's ability to participate in decision making and receiving relevant information about key areas. So, you know, one of the areas that we can work on this is when we start to develop and socialise our annual plan. So, thank you, Madam Chair. That's just a very brief overview, and I'm happy to move to questions.
Thank you. Questions? Mayor Holbrook.
Yeah, thank you. It's a question about the way the report's presented rather than any detail within it, which is all pretty clear with those reasons that are given for any kind of shortfalls. Just with these pie charts that are half orange, half a greeny colour, they kind of give a little bit of a weird picture in that they're only reporting on the measures that are due now, and they don't include the annual measures. So say we're missing one measure out of 8, but there's only 2 that are due now, and there's another 6 that are annual measures. We're 50% non-compliant. I'm wondering, have we ever done it before, and is it possible to have a pie chart which has a colour for annual measures, and then a colour for not achieved, and a colour for achieved, which might give a more accurate picture?
So through you, Madam Chair. So look, in our previous reports in this format, our pie chart used to show performance measures achieved, not yet achieved, and not yet due. So it did actually have all 3 dynamics. When you show it in that format, one of the disadvantages is you include the total population. So when you look at, so we achieved 74% of our performance measures that are reportable today. When we included all of them, that actually dropped down to 47%, which was actually misleading to the public. So this is a new way of reporting it. What we certainly could do is we could, in the third quarter results, just note the number of per activity, how many performance measures are annual. So we could look at bringing back the donut, which shows graphically how many are annual, but then still report on, because at the end of the day, this is a snapshot of council's performance as at 31 December. So it is actually more correct to basically say, well, how well have we tracked against the performance measures that we're measuring at this point in time? Whereas previously, although we showed it, we actually scored ourselves down, which was actually inaccurate and a bit misleading.
Would there be any reason why you couldn't have the donut showing the annual measures and then have a separate percentage that's about tracking against where we are now? Because I think both of them, would it be true to say that both of them would be slightly misleading but in different ways? Maybe it's something that requires further discussion.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good move. Councillor Coe.
Yes, I have a couple of questions through you, Madam Chair. Firstly, the benefit of doing these kind of reports is to identify the areas where there is variation and to think about what needs to be done differently going forward. I personally find it very useful to have a summary in these performance reports highlighting areas of variation, looking at the causes of the variation and what is going to be done to address those things going forward. That applies also to the, well, I think there's obviously reasons such as COVID, et cetera, why things haven't worked out, but also in terms of the satisfaction survey, as I noted the other day, dissatisfaction can arise from excess expectations and also under delivery. So to be looking at ways to narrow that gap by working on both sides of that equation. So I'm presuming that when you get these reports, there's some analysis of the variations. Can we not capture that in this report and provide some more meaningful analysis to the elected members around these issues? I'll just go on to the second question as well, and that is in particular in relation to the regulatory section. I note in the report there is some work being done around customer satisfaction in that area, and I'm just wondering how we can further integrate that into the reporting, because as I have said to this council in previous roles, and not just an elected member, I think it's really, really, really important that we're measuring our performance in the regulatory sector not by what our legal obligations are in terms of performance, but by customer satisfaction levels. And I think we are still, so can we look to incorporating a much higher level of customer satisfaction rating in the performance measures in that area? So those two separate questions. Thank you.
Yeah, pass over to James Jefferson.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair. I think one of the challenges in the regulatory environment is you have competing customers, and I think the most recent example of that is 240 Kapiti Road, and you have that tension between customer satisfaction between the regulated party and for example the applicant. So a developer would say it's hard to do business here because there's so much opposition, community opposition. Notwithstanding that, it is a piece of work we are trying to delve into and understand our customers better, and we've just brought on a customer engagement specialist to help us dive into that. But so I caveat that with that challenge of being a regulator, but it is something we want to do more of, and as we look at possibly the KPIs, certainly the commentary can pick up on that now, but the KPIs as we go into an LTP process and reset those in terms of where we're aiming to land with that customer satisfaction. I hope that helps. Happy to take any other questions.
I think Mark DeHaast was keen to respond as well.
So through you, Madam Chair. Councillor, thank you for your additional feedback on the paper, in particular the comments you made about the variations. So what this report has tried to successfully achieve is where a performance measure hasn't been achieved, it's tried to articulate why not and what are we doing about it. But we'll certainly take your comments back and flow through some improvements into the third quarter. So this is as what was set out in the covering paper, is that this report is effectively a rationalisation of previously 3 reports, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of additional detail. And the sole objective of this report is for members of our community to be able to pick up the report and actually very quickly and clearly understand how the council is performing. But we're on a journey to keep on adding to it, and so I think the feedback that I've been given is you would like a little bit more explanation about where there's variations, what are the actions that we're focusing over the next period of time. So there are examples of where the report does talk to that, but we'll take that through to the Q3 performance report. Thank you.
Can I just add to that and just say, yeah, that would be really good. I think to have a summary that really hones in on those variations, and there may be things where you say to us, hey, we actually need some more resource in this area, or we may be able to assist you in terms of ways to help close that gap. Yeah. So I think to just really, to me, the focus of the report should be on the variations, not the total. So a lot more emphasis on that. Coming back to the regulatory area, I think we need to understand what that expectations gap is. So while people might have unrealistic expectations, there is that that conflict around the regulatory side of it. But I think we need to understand the gap, what the gap is, and look at ways of closing it by working on both ends of the equation, both in terms of the expectation and the delivery. but unless we measure it and monitor it, we don't really get a picture of what's happening out there. So I think a gap doesn't imply that council isn't operating efficiently and effectively. It may just be excess expectations that we need to manage. So, but we need to understand what the landscape is out there.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, go for it.
So through you, Madam Chair. Look, thank you, Councillor. Absolutely take on board what you said. Just in terms of context, the council is a $100 million organisation per annum. Your financials are really sound. There's 84 performance measures across all the activities. The resident opinion survey, which is included in the report, is the source data for about 12 or 15 of those 84 performance measures, and you're sampling 800 residents per year with a tolerable error of 3.5%. So if you do look through the what I'm hearing you saying is greater emphasis on variations, almost exceptional, report by exception, but if the report was just highlighting what council is doing wrong, that would be misleading as well. It's doing a lot extremely well. It's a large organisation. We've got a high net value, and we've got 84 performance measures, where 12 of them, in opinion, are saying that we can do better. And we have said in the report we will do better. Absolutely take on board what you're saying, but I think it's very important that we produce a balanced report which actually highlights what we do well as well.
Yeah, just somewhere in there with a summary of any variation, and hopefully it's even an uptick and not the other way. So it could be something to consider. Councillor Halliday.
Through you, Madam Chair. I have some questions. And some of them are just general questions as well, but I thought this is a good forum to do it. Page 71, number 4, talks to Otaria Park, and I might sound like a stuck record, but we're coming into a new triennium now. I think it's important that either a community board member or definitely a ward councillor be involved in the working group around Otaria Park. That's been... I've seemed to have not been able to get traction in that space with regards to what's, again, been in the community board for 3 years, and I still don't really know what's going on over there. As such, that would be very, very helpful. Just back that up as note, and I'm sure it'll be patched back up at
I think if these
are
nice and quick to just be noted, so we can keep the questions very much in relation to the performance report. Yeah.
Yep. Page 74. Just with regards, and I'll just refer to the pages on the agenda rather than the pages of the report. So on page 74, note we're quite a way behind in the capital project spend. That's not a negative necessarily. I'm sure there's a lot of factors to it, but I'm just curious to know whether we are on track to be meeting all our capital program as such, or are we likely to potentially fall short?
So through you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Councillor. Yes, so you're talking to the capital project spend chart on page 74, and as you correctly pointed out, year to date, we're broadly speaking in line with budget. The chart is showing actual spend against budget spend for the 6 months. Just as we can see, look, we're forecasting to be slightly below full year budget at this stage. As we well know, in terms of our CapEx program, things are coming in, a lot more expensive than what we thought, so we're spending a lot more. We have identified that we'll carry things forward, but look, generally speaking, as at sort of 31st of December, we are indicating that we do expect an uplift in work on our capital program. These are forecasts as at 31 December, and as we track through and progress through the financial year, that position may change in the third year report. Sorry, in the quarter 3 report. Further on in the report, I think when we get into the financial overview, there's actually a table which shows the capital work program by activity, and it shows the key areas where we expect an uplift. We are constantly always working with our activity managers to have a look at what we think that we're going to spend, but we are still in that stage where contract prices that are coming back are exceeding our initial estimates, and we are light on resources. So I do expect that will change.
Thank you, Mark. Page 106.
Oh, sorry, Councillor Halliday. I think Sean.
Oh, sorry, my apologies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just going to add the, I mean, if you were looking for one of those key themes or a key area of differences, we may be spending more money but potentially delivering less in terms of the capital works program because of the additional costs associated with those projects that are moving forward in terms of delivery. So that's probably the key, the difference there around the amount of money that's been spent relative to what's actually been delivered on the ground.
On page 106, noted it mentioned a staff work program with around, which is absolutely fantastic. Contracted external, it's in the middle of the page. Contracted external provider created delivery a 6-month online program covering Te Ao Māori and Te Reo Māori for professionals to 160 council personnel. Absolutely fantastic to see that initiative, but it's sort of been brought up earlier today in other aspects as well. It'd be really, really helpful for councillors or community board members to perhaps have access to that or a similar type of program. As Kim talked about before, you know, it's we can say certain things, but it's helping us get that understanding in that space as well. And there are a few opportunities other than just reading some books. Which, by the way, that tikanga book that was provided, absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
I'd recommend it to anyone with regards to a first step in that direction.
Great
Just something
comment.
for consideration,
Did you want to
please.
reply, Janice? No? Yeah.
Yes, Councillor, and as we look to the second part of the induction program, the post-Christmas, you've all had a chance to have a break and get refreshed part of the program. That's absolutely what we'll be exploring as part of that.
And as part of that question, I'd also ask, if we, do we have a manager in the EB liaison team as such, now that Kahu's left?
Darren? Was that? Oh, yeah.
Currently, you can direct any questions you have to me while we're in the process of rebuilding that space.
Fantastic. Page 112. Sort of makes reference to the 4 key things that were in the long-term plan. I just wanted to ask with regards to the airport and our relationship with it. I note that the reviews of the Waitangi Tribunal are being looked at and considered. But I would ask, how are we going with regards, or are we building any relationship with Puketapu Hapu ki Paraparumu, who obviously are very involved in that space, and also the Templeton Group, who currently own the airport? Do we have meetings or things lined up in any formal way? How are we building that relationship?
Through you. The short answer, Councillor Halliday, is yes. And I think the airport is on, or will be on the work program to come back and talk to Council about in due course. There's a lot of moving parts that you've mentioned, so it's quite a complex space. So there's several layers through the organisation who are engaged with those 2 groups you've mentioned.
Thank you. On page 123, we have a table around capital spending. I noted there was a strategic property upgrades. We're just talking about things that potentially stand out as a discrepancy, but I note we spent 2.85 million in that space, which wasn't budgeted for as such. Mind you, I'm just curious to know what that strategic property upgrades is. Is that a sort of a property upgrade program that's being put in place, or is it something perhaps looking offline?
Mike Mendoza. Yeah. Are we going to Ian?
Through you, Madam Chair, and afternoon, everybody. That item relates to assets that were acquired by Council in relation to or in satisfaction of development contribution and FC obligations by a developer. So rather than being paid in cash, we acquired reserves and some works.
So that's being looked at as a vested type scenario. My apologies. I thought it was an expense.
It was in satisfaction of the obligation the developer had.
Sorry, my misreading of this. I thought that was an expenditure box.
So, through you, Madam Chair. Councillor, you'll be familiar with our assets that normally get vested to us, which are recorded as revenue on the income statement. This one was a little bit different. Ultimately, we've received an asset. So, in full obligation of a developer to us in exchange for land, it's recorded as an asset. So it's how we account for it. It's reflected as an asset. So it sits as a capital asset. So it's just one of those anomalies that you haven't seen before. But essentially, it's an asset to the council.
Okay, that's cool, because it did bring up a question I had around, the revenue statement shows at 170.5 million, and that's for stuff which is about 48.5 million of vested Waka Kotahi asset there as well. But I just do wonder, thank you very much, I've separated out some of the other information in the past, but I do wonder whether that's a little bit misleading to, say, the general community that might be looking at what council's earning per se, because there's two aspects to that. There's if you want a better way of putting it, a cash flow via rates and other bits and pieces, but the vested aspect of things, a lot of people might be looking at that and going, well, where did $170 million cash come from? As such, it's maybe splitting hairs a little bit, but yeah, that caught my eye quite quickly with regards to it sort of being a bit out of whack. But that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Councillor Halliday. Councillor Spies.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to, and yes, Mark, I have read it all, and I just wanted to congratulate you on a really good report. And I've noticed all the 100%, and I have noticed that some that are not 100% are due to COVID or staff shortages. But one of my comments, or what I wanted to ask, was Councillor Halliday's already brought up, and that's on page 112, and I just wondered around the airport if there was any timeline around that.
Just for clarification, Councillor Spears, are you meaning timeline around coming back to council? Right. I guess we're proposing that we'll be engaging on the work program with you before the next SONF meeting to land the timeframes of that. Part of the challenge will be externally what's happening and when things may land through external process. So we can always come and update you on the engagements we're having and where things have got to, but there'll be a long life to this, I think is the point I'm making.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as Chris has just said, the conversation around kind of timeframes of these sorts of things, both the briefings and the decisions coming back to council, if there are any, we'll have a couple of workshops ahead of our next SONF meeting to kind of firm up the work program for the committee, and that will be where you can raise those sorts of questions as well, and your wishes in that space.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool, thanks, Councillor Spies. Community Board Member Simon Black.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, Mark, I'd like to congratulate you and the team. I think from being here on the inside and listening to you and the reports and what's actually going on, I think you and the team are doing a brilliant job, and I feel like our council's in good hands, so I appreciate that. Thank you. What I'd like to observe is I do agree about balanced approaches. If we've got too much green and not enough red, people aren't going to believe it, because we know on grassroots level we do have issues. So what don't we know that we don't know? Are we finding out those areas? And why are we getting greens in our report but our customer satisfaction is going down to average from supportive? So why is there a difference going on there? And this report doesn't seem to recognise that variability there. What I have also observed is that we've got a new, let's say, structure to the council, and some of the groups I'm on, next one's the environmental, and also earlier in the week was the social sustainability. what I can see is, let's say on page 77, which is the 1.1 activities, I think we've got a mismatch in how we're reporting, possibly. How we're reporting our social sustainability and environmental aspects, where I think, especially coming from Aotaki, I think there are aspects in social sustainability we need to actually enhance and support a lot of our community there. And so I wouldn't give us complete greens in certain areas, and just wondering, we've got environmental down the bottom there in the green, but we don't actually have an environmental part of the actual main activities and social sustainability. Where are we rating on that, and how are we improving on that? Because we don't have a section there, probably because it's just a new committee. And wondering if we need to just look at alignment of how we are reporting versus how we're structured, so we don't have gaps and overlaps.
Yeah, great question, Simon. I think maybe Chris or Mark or yeah.
Sorry, we're just conferring it at this end. I think we will be coming back through the long-term plan process to look at whether we've got the right balance of measures, which I think you might be highlighting, Simon. There might be gaps in what we currently report now that are meaningful from sort of an on-the-ground perspective that we'll be able to test. So what we're reporting now is what is agreed in our current long-term plan. So but acknowledge the point that you're making, and if I may say, your point around what we're reporting versus what we might be seeing in opinion surveys is, I think, to the Mayor's earlier point, there's a whole bunch of measures that are annually reported that aren't in the mix at the moment. So what you're seeing is what we know of what we can report today. So there is the potential that is not fully lined up until year end, where we'll have that overall picture.
Thank you very much. Because what I see, if you gave this report to someone in the street, and I'll take you and say, does this align with your perception of council or how you're being supported? It'd be interesting to see their comments, because there's so much information versus, for me, this is just so far high up that I don't think the average person will be able to reconcile this with their actual day-to-day living, which is a problem.
For sure. And measuring kind of what will make a difference to that person's everyday living as well. And I think what Chris has said around the long-term plan conversations and the conversations that will be had in the lead up to that is a perfect point in time to raise that and influence the process. So make a note of it, and
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah, Mark Hast.
Through you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Simon, for the compliments. Look, the only thing that I did really want to add is that the council's current long-term plan not only sets out what our outcomes are, what our strategic outcomes are. It does set out our activities, and per each activity, what are the levels of service and the KPIs that we use to measure those. But the long-term plan, in essence, sets a framework that we follow for 3 years. So the annual report is effectively reporting our annual performance against the long-term plan. This report is reporting our performance against the long-term plan, which is why it's set out in activities. So we've quite often had discussions around this table. Can you start reporting your capital works program at a ward level? Can you start reporting at an outcome level? Can you start doing this? But it's meant to reflect and report back on the long-term plan, which is done by consultation. So I've heard everything you've said, and I've heard Chris's response, but this report is reporting on council's performance and non-financial performance, but it's pointed directly at the long-term plan. So that's why it has to talk about the activities, it has to talk about the levels of service and the KPIs. The resident opinion survey is directly linked to some of those KPIs, and it does also go a little bit further. It asks, only in the survey does it ask, how do you feel we're delivering on our strategic outcomes? The long-term plan in itself doesn't have a measure on how we deliver against the outcomes. So in the front, when you go through this report and you look at each activity, and there's green and then there's amber, we opted not to put red because there's some performance measures that are reportable at a point in time that we are doing something about it and still have a runway to achieve those by the end of the year. But there is a little bit different. The resident opinion survey is asking, on some of the measures, but then it's asking on a lot of different things. So where you get, we're sort of trending downwards on ability to have my say, and I'm not, getting better information for big ticket items that are affecting me. I think with the point that you're raising, we're trending downwards in that space, but then in the report we've got a green on everything else. So it's just asking a few different things. The resident opinion survey asks our residents, how do you feel we are achieving our strategic outcomes? But that's only 114 people responded to that. So there is a disconnect, but the this report does need to still report back on how we are tracking against that long-term plan. As Chris has said, the next long-term plan, there's an opportunity to revisit the resident opinion survey. There's an opportunity to revisit all the performance measures, how we measure our strategic outcomes. So there is an opportunity to make changes as we start to progress developing our next long-term plan.
Cool.
But
Thank you,
this has to stay.
Awesome. Was that all of the questions that you had?
Just my final comment on that. The residents' survey, how well was it responded to, and do we know the demograph? I just want to understand a little bit more about the representation of how that survey was answered.
I think probably, the easiest way to get answers to those questions is the briefing slides from the briefing we had on Tuesday around the Residents' Opinion Surveyor and LG Hub. So I can help you, find those, and we can have Ian or Mark would answer questions, I'm sure, offline.
I won't take up the time then.
As to those.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thanks, Simon. Councillor Wilson, and if we could make this the last question, I haven't seen any more lights, and hopefully a pretty brief one because we're approaching 1 p.m. In fact, we might have already hit it.
Yeah, one of the questions that Ian spoke to, this anomaly of 2.8 million, whatever the number was, who sets the value for that is question number one. Because quite often my understanding is what developers do, in lieu of paying money, they find the shittiest piece of land that they're not going to be able to do anything with, and they give that to council and go, there you go. So is that the situation here? And one way of testing that, of course, if it's a genuine asset, could you sell it tomorrow for the same amount of money or more? A few questions in there.
I think Mike's going to...
So Sean and I can both probably contribute to that. We're acutely aware of that alleged tactic by developers, and are very cautious when we enter these agreements. We use an independent valuer when we set these valuations to avoid that very issue, councillor. But we're aware of some examples of behaviour in the past that haven't been great, and we are very careful not to let that occur. In fact, in Chris's area now, we have a person who is specifically looking at those sorts of developer agreements, so that doesn't happen. So I'm speaking from the perspective of reserves and parks contributions. Sean will have something to add in terms of the infrastructure contributions.
Thank you. Yes, so that one was not only a contribution regarding reserves in terms of land, there were also other infrastructure improvements that they delivered that were over and above their minimum requirements as part of their subdivision. So that's why council paid for those, which is generally you'll see them as vested assets because they come across as part of the subdivision. With this one, we took an opportunity to do more in terms of widening footpaths and providing some upgrades that were then vested over to council. So that's why the number is slightly higher than you would potentially see. But it was also subject to a separate paper that came to council to sign that off in terms of the agreement, and I'm happy to talk to you offline about that. If I don't think it was it was probably the last triennium that paper came through to council.
And it's good to see that it was acknowledged that there was a practice there that wasn't a particularly wholesome one. It's cool. Sorry? Alleged practice. Oh, no, it was absolutely a practice. Yeah. Nothing alleged about it. So the other thing too is with regards these, some of these the surveys and the perceptions of them, question I have is around, let's say housing, for instance, 33% of people, it's not a positive, it's not a great number about perception, and everybody hates the hangman, but people very often forget about the person who told them to do the hanging, right? And very often what we're doing now is we're enacting central government policy, or we are, it's a consequence. So housing in Kapiti isn't necessarily a consequence of what this council has decided to do. It's a consequence of what somebody else has decided to do, but the public perception around it. So question is, and this comes back to what Liz was saying earlier about how realistic people's expectations are, and so perceptions around that, and then it raises an even bigger question. I can't find the numbers anywhere. The residents' satisfaction surveys, there are so many caveats on the responses to those and the value or otherwise of those responses. It seems if people say really nice things about us, we go, da-da-da-da. And if they say really shitty things about us, we go, wow, it was only 118 of them or whatever. Do you know what I mean? So if they're not just being used for PR value, is there a real value? And when you've got such a low number, N equals not very many. And what is the cost of that? What is the cost of that? Not just the cost of doing it, but the cost of analysing it, etc., etc. And is there a real value in these things beyond the potential for PR?
I think maybe this is something we can pick up through the LTP conversation, because it's not directly relevant to the report on the table today. Did you have any other questions, Nigel?
Yeah, I think it is relevant, because we're talking about overall satisfaction with trends, etc., and what the public response to that is. And so then there's, drilling down into the real stuff, the numbers that explain why the perceptions are what they are. Are they real?
Yeah.
And if they are real, then what are we doing to address them? And staff have their role to address them, but so do the politicians. And so sometimes we need the drilling down to have happened, so we know what's the real picture here. Because, again, politicians have a role to play in what the perception of what we're doing is, accurate or otherwise.
No, good point. Yeah. And what I was referring to in terms of it not being relevant, apologies, was around shaping those up in the conversations about future or any kind of changes to performance measures or residents' opinion surveys. But noting your concerns around potentially the way things are done now, and we can have those conversations about how it might need to change for us to all be completely satisfied with that. Councillor Pravanov, and can we keep these questions very brief, because I did say Councillor Wilson would be the last.
Yes, so thank you. So I do have some questions, and I'm happy to wait until after lunch if that is appropriate.
Okay, was there going to be much debate on this? Do we know, are people really keen to say their piece? How about we just get the questions out of the way, and then, hopefully we'll have enough time.
Okay, thank you. So my first question relates, I suppose, so this is a half-yearly report. And so we've had a briefing on the residents' satisfaction report, which is actually a quarterly report. But what seems to me to be the case is that the figure from that quarterly report has come through on the half-yearly report. And if you actually look at the first quarter and the second quarter, the average of that is actually higher than what shows 53%.
So through you, Madam Chair. So look, absolutely, Councillor, you're correct. So it is a half-year report which covers 2 quarters. In terms of the resident opinion survey, so that it's a resident opinion survey because that's what it is, but it reflects resident satisfaction. It does show on page 131, it does show you the Q1 and Q2 results. It is a snapshot at a point in time, so it is a half-year performance as at the 31st of December. So that's why the 53% that's on page 130 is the second quarter. But it actually does show you the first and second quarter's results. And then in the activities, we're showing you quarter 1 spend actual versus quarter 1 budget, quarter 2 spend actual versus quarter 2 budget, And then the performance measures are cumulative in Q1, Q2. So it's reporting on all the performance measures that are reportable as at 31 December.
Thank you for that. So it was my understanding in the briefing the other day that at the end, so we do this, these resident satisfaction surveys every quarter, and at the end of the whole year, they're averaged out. So I... Not averaged out. They're not averaged.
They're annualised, so that's basically it's first, second, third, and then fourth, which is then an overall result, and those go into the annual report.
So they're edited together.
So the annual report is so the annual report takes the full sample of 800 respondents, and then it does the adjustment for the neutral. So it's an overall snapshot of the year. So it's 200, 200, 200, 200, which really is the answer that Simon was asking earlier, and then does an overall satisfaction based on the 800. So that's why we go to a tolerable error of 3.5%, because it's over the larger sample taken as one set.
Yeah, I suppose that's what I was thinking. So really, so for half a year, it should be over 400 people rather than 200.
I'm just wondering if you'd be happy to take these questions offline, Councillor Pravanov.
Yeah. Yes, okay.
Okay.
So the other one too is in this here, it's got, the last one is here, trust and council to do the right thing. I'm not sure where that's come from. Well, it's, if that could be pointed out to me.
So through research first, so through you, Madam Chair, through research first, when we reset the resident opinion survey to be just that and actually be the source of information for selected KPIs, through research first, they identified through the questionnaire what were the three main drivers that would influence residents' perception the most. And trust in the council to do the right thing is one of those key drivers.
Right, okay, so it's not actually a question, it's actually a driver.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. Were those all of your questions?
So
we can...
I have, I suppose, one other comment, and that was just to reiterate quite a big discussion we had in the briefing the other day, and I think you brought it up today about going forward about looking at the targets and the KPIs and how they're actually set. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Councillor Pravanov. Councillor Coe.
Very quick, this is very
very brief.
Very quick.
I'll time you.
Look, I'm not a statistician. I'm not a statistician, but I have studied stats to master's level. And I just want to clarify this thing about sample size, because it's a mathematical formula. When you have your total population and you decide what confidence level is acceptable to you, it's a simple calculation to work out a sample size that will give you that level of confidence. So when we talk about small numbers in our sample, it's actually statistically significant. It might sound like a small number, but it will give you the result within that confidence level. So don't be put off by small sample sizes, well, what appears to be a small sample size. Thank you.
Awesome. Just a comment. So is there someone who would like to move these recommendations on page 64, A and B? Councillor Halliday, happy to move. A seconder? Awesome. Right of introduction?
No.
No. Any debate?
Good.
Wow, well done. I'd just like to say a massive thanks to staff for the... We did have a seconder. It was Councillor Kirby. Yeah. Sorry. Went a bit too quickly. So, yeah, moved by Councillor Halliday, seconded by Councillor Kirby. Got caught up in trying to get through this nice and quickly. But, yeah, the fact that there is no debate, I guess, is really just a massive testament to the huge amounts of work that's gone into this report. And, yeah, just the amount of work that goes in not only to producing these sorts of reports, but every single day to make sure that there's things to, put in the report and things to measure ourselves on and things to include within those measures. So, yeah, thank you so much for all of the mahi to the whole team. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
No.
Through you, Madam Chair. Look, I just wanted to, so earlier during the meeting, I actually had to send a notice out to staff just to acknowledge that our Chief Financial Officer, Ian Georgeson, leaves us on the 23rd of February. So this was his, this report was his baby, and this was the last one that was presented today. So Ian leaves us to pursue personal interests. So we're not losing him to a competitor, and there will always be Ian's in my office more than I am. So I'm sure he'll from time to time come and say hello. But if we maybe just wish big thanks to Ian and wish him all the best for his future endeavours.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Almost feel like we need to do a round of applause. Some way of acknowledging. Kia ora, Ian. Thanks for your mahi over a long period of time, right from the last trainium all through this one too, the very beginning stages of it, and just an enormous amount of knowledge and big shoes to fill for sure. So thanks for all your work. So the motion's been moved, seconded. Any more debate? No. All those in favour? Aye. Against? That's carried. Awesome. We're doing pretty well. Okay, so moving on to, where are we now? Confirmation of minutes, page 137. Any challenges, issues? Moved? Can we have a seconder? Seconded. All those in favour? Aye. Against? That's carried. Confirmation of public excluded minutes, there are none, and our closing karakia. I wonder if either of our iwi partners would like to do that, otherwise I'm happy to close us in karakia. Oh, did you? Kia ora, ngā mihi. And thank you, thanks councillors, community board members, iwi partners and staff for getting us through nice and quickly. So we'll have a lunch break, and then I believe we can start the next meeting anywhere within 30 minutes. So we can still break until whenever Councillor Pravana wants to begin. Back at 1:45? Yeah. Is that good with you? In case somebody don't. Oh, yeah.